old age, love isn't loud. It doesn't wear red roses or shout from rooftops. It just sits quietly beside you, like an old friend who never left. The sun was setting beyond the maple trees. The porch light hadn't come on yet, but it didn't need to. She knew where he would be. Same chair, same blanket, same silence. And of course, the same chipped porcelain teacup resting in his wrinkled hands. His name was Walter Raymond, a retired librarian, 78 years old, with silver hair combed neatly to the side and eyes that still searched the horizon, as if expecting someone from 50 years ago to suddenly walk down the gravel road. And she, Margaret Lane, was 75, a widow of 30 years. Her laugh had once lit up ballrooms. Now it echoed softly in old teacups and folded sweaters. They lived next door for 40 years, and yet they'd never said "I love you" to each other. Not once. But every evening, for the past 22 years, she brewed the tea. He brought the biscuits, and they sat together, not speaking much, not needing to. Because some loves don't begin with kisses. They begin with quiet company, and stay like the scent of old books, unfading, familiar. Walter was 27 then, tall, shy, and always seen with a satchel full of books. He had just moved into the old cottage after his mother passed. He was alone, painfully so. Margaret was newly married to Edward Lane, a man of charm, money, and business suits. Their love had been arranged, their wedding expensive, their silences frequent. The first time Margaret saw Walter, he was planting tulips in his garden. She smiled. He didn't look up. She said hello. He nodded. And just like that, without knowing why, she began watching him water those flowers every morning. Something about him felt still, unshaken, like he carried something inside that nobody could touch. Maybe even love. Over the years, Margaret would wave at Walter from her porch. He would smile, raise his hand slightly, and return to his book. Sometimes he left a flower on her fence, no note, just a tulip or a daffodil. And sometimes she would leave cookies on his porch in return. No words, no thank you, just gestures, soft and wordless. When her husband passed in '92, Walter came to the funeral. He stood in the back, said nothing, but when she looked up and saw him standing beneath the church bell, she didn't cry anymore. That night he left a single rose on her doormat, and she made tea for two. It's 2025 now. Margaret is slower. Her hands tremble when she pours the tea. Walter walks with a cane. He reads with glasses now. But nothing else has changed. Every evening they sit on that porch. He listens to the birds. She knits in silence. Sometimes their hands brush, and neither pulls away. They still haven't said "I love you." But when she coughs, he gets up for water. When he shivers, she silently places a second blanket over his legs. No drama, no declarations. Just devotion. Some loves don't need names. They don't need rings or ceremonies. They just need presence. A shared silence. A teacup between two trembling hands. He still remembers her favorite sugar, brown, 1 teaspoon. She still places a book beside his chair when he naps. Every Christmas he gives her a tulip. Just one. Every New Year, she bakes lemon bread, the same way he likes it. Once, during a storm, the electricity went out. She knocked on his door with a candle in hand. He opened it, already holding a flashlight for her. They laughed. That was the only time he ever touched her face. He wiped a raindrop from her cheek. Neither spoke a word. But the moment hung in the air, like a kiss that never landed, and yet meant everything. In her room, Margaret keeps a box of memories. Inside, the first flower he ever gave her, an old note that simply says "for your garden," and a photo, taken by a neighbor 20 years ago. They're sitting side by side, not touching, just looking at the same sunset. In Walter's room, he has a notebook. The cover says, "Things I Never Said." Page 1. I wish I'd told Margaret she saved me. One evening, Walter didn't come. The tea sat getting cold. The porch light flickered on, then off, and Margaret sat alone. She looked toward the gravel path, empty. She waited, and waited, until the stars began to show. Then she stood up, slowly, holding the teacup tight. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, because she knew, even if he wasn't there, he had never left. In old age, love makes no noise. It just stays behind in gestures, in teacups, in the quiet spaces between two chairs. Because in old age, love doesn't vanish. It just changes form. It becomes memory, routine, an empty chair, a worn-out sweater, a final note written too late. She never married again, never moved out, never missed a single evening on that porch. One spring, a young couple moved into Walter's house. They were in their 30s, newlyweds, curious and kind. They noticed the old woman next door with 2 teacups every evening. One day, the young lady walked over and asked softly, "Why 2 cups, ma'am?" Margaret looked up, smiled, and said, "One for me, and one for the man who never left." The young woman paused, nodded slowly, and left her a flower the next day, a white tulip. Margaret held it to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Hello again, Walter." And the rocking chair moved ever so slightly beside her. Because in old age, love doesn't need noise. It just needs presence, even if it's no longer visible. Because in old age, love doesn't vanish. It just changes form. It becomes memory, routine, an empty chair, a worn-out sweater, a final note written too late. She never married again, never moved out, never missed a single evening on that porch. One spring, a young couple moved into Walter's house. They were in their 30s, newlyweds, curious and kind. They noticed the old woman next door with 2 teacups every evening. One day, the young lady walked over and asked softly, "Why 2 cups, ma'am?" Margaret looked up, smiled, and said, "One for me, and one for the man who never left." The young woman paused, nodded slowly, and left her a flower the next day, a white tulip. Margaret held it to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Hello again, Walter." And the rocking chair moved ever so slightly beside her. Because in old age, love doesn't need noise. It just needs presence, even if it's no longer visible. She no longer needed an alarm clock. Her mornings began with the echo of memories. Margaret would wake up before dawn, her bones protesting like old wood in winter. She'd sit up slowly, her hands instinctively reaching for the cardigan folded neatly beside her bed, the same one she wore the night she found Walter's notebook. The house was always quiet, not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that waits, like an unanswered question hanging in the walls. She walked to the kitchen with a slow rhythm, feet in slippers that barely made a sound against the floorboards. 2 cups on the counter, a worn-out kettle, and that same tin of loose-leaf tea Walter once gifted her. Its label faded, the scent still clinging. She never changed her routine. Boil water, add 2 scoops, let it steep for exactly 5 minutes. 2 cups, 1 spoon of brown sugar for hers, no sugar for his. She poured it anyway, into both. Because love like this doesn't end when a person leaves. It lingers in the routine, in the hands that remember how many minutes he liked his tea steeped, how much milk clouded the color just right. After breakfast, she opened the curtains and watched the street wake up. The mailman, the school bus, a neighbor walking his golden retriever. But the porch across the fence remained still. It was April now. The tulips were returning, red, yellow, and a single white one she had planted quietly that winter. The one that reminded her of him. Some days, she spoke to him, not aloud, but in the quiet of her thoughts. "I remembered your sweater today," she'd think. "The one with the missing button. I could never convince you to throw it away." Or, "You should have seen the moon last night. It was the kind of night we never wasted indoors." She didn't need a reply. She never had. Walter's love had always been the kind that listened more than it spoke. At the library downtown, there was a bench now, dark oak, with a small brass plaque that read, "For Walter Raymond," who read more than he spoke and loved more than he let on. She visited it every Sunday. She would sit there for half an hour, sometimes longer, watching the sunlight move across the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rustle of pages from young readers, the quiet shuffle of feet among the aisles. She remembered how he used to sit here, right by the window, always reading, always with his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for something, or someone. The librarian, a young girl named Lily with short curly hair and kind eyes, once brought her a cup of tea. "Your husband used to sit right here, didn't he?" she asked. Margaret smiled softly. "He wasn't my husband. Not really. But yes, this was his favorite spot." Lily nodded, not asking more, as if sensing that this was one of those rare kinds of love stories that didn't need details, only presence. One afternoon, Margaret opened the notebook again. The one he left behind. Only one page had writing, the rest was blank. She turned it slowly, page after page of untouched paper, empty lines waiting. She placed her hand on a blank page and whispered, "What if I filled the rest, Walter?" And so she began. Not as a writer. She'd never written much in her life. But as someone whose heart was full. She began to write letters. To him. To herself. To the years that passed them by. To the love that never asked for anything, and yet gave her everything. "Dear Walter," she wrote one morning, "you never said the words, but you never had to. That night when I couldn't sleep, and you left a book by my door, poetry, of all things, I knew. Bore. Walter, I remember when you stood outside in the snow because my husband was yelling. You didn't ring the bell. You just stood there, a silent guard until the lights went off. I saw you through the window, and I never forgot." Each page became a memory, and each memory became a truth she had long buried under decades of silence. And with every line she wrote, she felt less alone. At night, she'd sit on her porch, the notebook in her lap, and whisper aloud what she wrote. Neighbors passing by assumed she was just humming or mumbling to herself, but she was speaking to him, to the space beside her, to the love that had outlived the man who carried it. One rainy afternoon, she found a letter in her mailbox. No stamp, no name. Inside it, a small note on cream-colored paper. "He loved you, you know. We all knew. He just didn't know how to say it." There was no signature. She clutched it to her chest, eyes wet. Maybe it was the librarian, maybe the old neighbor, maybe no one. Or maybe it was him. In dreams, she saw him more often now. Always seated, always in that chair, smiling, not speaking. One night, in her dream, he finally spoke. "I waited so long to hear you say it," he whispered. She reached for his hand in the dream, and when she woke, her fingers were outstretched toward the pillow beside her. And there, unbelievably, a white tulip lay. Fresh, no dew, no stem snapped, just perfect. She cried, truly cried, not for sorrow, for the beauty of being loved, fully, completely, even when words never came. As she placed the tulip into a small glass vase, she whispered to it the words she'd kept all her life. I loved you too, Walter. And the house felt warmer somehow, the air lighter. She walked outside and sat in her chair, 2 teacups again by her side. And as the wind blew, the chair beside hers rocked just a little, but enough. Because in old age, love doesn't need words. It just needs a place to return to. Even if it's only a porch with 2 empty chairs and a teacup waiting. She had stopped expecting anything from the world. The world had taken enough from her. Time, youth, family, friends. But one thing it could not take was the space Walter had left behind. It lived in the bend of her fingers when she held the cup. It lived in the way she paused before opening the front door, always half hoping that maybe, his voice would call her name from across the fence one last time. But life didn't work like that. Not in this world. Still, something was shifting. She could feel it in the quiet. The dreams came more often now, some clearer than others. One morning she woke with his name on her lips, and the sound lingered in the room like the smell of coffee on a cold day. That same morning, when she opened the front door, she saw something unusual. A small brown package on her porch. No name, no stamp, just wrapped neatly in old paper with string tied in a delicate bow. She brought it in, hands trembling. Inside was a book. No title, just a leather-bound journal. She opened it slowly. Page 1. A poem. Handwritten. I loved you in the silence, in spaces between years, in moments where we didn't speak, but everything was heard. Her fingers brushed the words like they were skin. She turned the page. More handwriting, stories, observations, descriptions of her garden, her porch, the way her scarf always matched her teacup, the way she looked when she smiled at birds. It was Walter. It had to be. But how? There were hundreds of entries, letters addressed to no one, or maybe to her. Maybe he'd been writing them for years. She spent the whole afternoon reading, her breath catching in her chest, her eyes wet and red, and full of something between ache and awe. Each page pulled her deeper, into the man she thought she knew, and the world he had kept quietly inside. He'd written of the times she sang to herself while sweeping the porch, the way she paused before opening her mailbox, as if hoping for something more than bills. The time she cried behind the curtain after her husband's funeral, and how he'd stood outside in the cold for 2 hours, just in case she needed him. Every entry was a window, and she looked through each one like someone searching for their younger self. But what truly shattered her was the last page. It was dated 2 days before he died. Margaret, it began. I always thought I had more time. Time to find the right words. Time to stand up one evening and say what I should have said long ago. But I was never brave like you. I watched you live. I watched you laugh through pain. I watched you keep going, and I loved you for it. I never stopped, and I hope, wherever I end up, I find you there, with a cup of tea, and that quiet smile. She closed the book slowly and held it to her chest. She didn't cry this time. There was a peace in her that hadn't been there before. That night, she placed the journal on his empty chair and lit a small candle beside it. Then she spoke aloud, voice shaking but steady. I forgive you, Walter. for not saying it, for waiting too long, because somehow you still made me feel it every single day." The candle flickered as if nodding back. In the days that followed, Margaret changed nothing. Still 2 cups. Still the same blanket folded on the chair. Still talking to him in whispers and pauses. But inside, something had opened. She began walking again, just a few steps each day, past their old favorite spots. The bakery where he once bought her a lemon tart, but left it without a note. The park bench where they'd once sat during a summer storm without saying a word for 20 minutes. And somehow, it had felt like the most complete conversation she ever had. She began writing too. She took an old notebook, the kind she hadn't touched since the 80s, and wrote down everything she could remember. Every story, every gesture, every word he didn't say, but still managed to convey. Not for anyone else, just for her. Just to keep him alive, 1 page at a time. One evening, a young boy from the neighborhood, no older than 12, came by while she was watering her tulips. "Ma'am," he said politely, "my mom says you used to know the man who lived in that house." She smiled gently. "I still do." The boy blinked, confused. "But he's gone, right?" She nodded. "But some people stay," she said, pointing to her chest. "In here. Some people never leave." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then he offered her a crumpled drawing, a sketch of 2 rocking chairs and a cat beneath them. "I made this for you." Her eyes filled, but she kept her voice steady. "It's beautiful. Thank you." That night, she placed the drawing on the wall inside her hallway, just beside the photograph of Walter's porch. 2 chairs, always 2, because even now he was there. He was in the breeze, in the silence, in the second teacup she would never stop placing, because in old age, love doesn't disappear. It slows down, it softens, it whispers instead of sings, and if you listen closely, you might still hear it breathing beside you. The days had grown slower, softer. The light through the curtains fell a little dimmer than it used to. Margaret often found herself staring at it for minutes, watching the dust particles float like tiny memories. Weightless, timeless. She wasn't afraid of being alone anymore, because she had never truly been alone. Not since Walter. Even in silence, he was there. And now, more than ever, he was everywhere. In the morning stillness, in the creak of her porch steps, in the smell of old books, in the white tulips that continued to bloom, even out of season. She began waking up earlier, to write, to remember, to leave something behind, not for the world, but for him. Her journal, once a blank companion, was now filled with tiny, elegant handwriting. Each entry a quiet letter to the past, and each word a stitch in the great invisible thread that still tied her heart to his. She began writing about their almost conversations. The way he looked at her hands when she laughed. How he always left a flower but never said why. How she waited, year after year, for him to knock on her door, even once. But in those memories, there was no bitterness anymore. Only warmth. Only peace. One morning in late October, when the air was just beginning to smell like leaves and wood smoke, Margaret didn't rise with the sun. She stayed in bed longer, watching the light dance on the ceiling. Her hands were slower, her breath quieter. She felt no pain, only weightlessness, as if her body had grown tired of gravity and was asking to rest, just a little longer. She closed her eyes, not in fear, but in surrender. And when she finally opened them again, she wasn't in her room anymore. She was sitting on a porch, but not her own. The air was golden, the wind soft. And beside her, there he was. Walter. Younger, just slightly, as she remembered him best. Not flawless, but full of that gentle calm she had loved in silence for decades. He was holding a teacup, the second one. And for the first time, in a voice clear as morning sunlight, he said, "I waited for you." She looked down, in her hand, her own teacup, warm. She smiled. So did he. No need for explanations, no need for tears. Somewhere between life and what comes after, they sat together. In peace. In presence. In love, finally unspoken. And yet completely understood. Back on Earth, the young couple who lived in Walter's old house found Margaret peacefully in her bed that morning, a book resting gently on her chest. It was titled, The Second Teacup, a quiet love story. Inside were pages of handwritten reflections, moments, letters, poems, and one final message. If you are reading this, don't wait to say what your heart knows. Love doesn't need to shout, but it does need to be heard, even if only once. The town library placed the book in a glass case, right next to the bench under Walter's plaque. And every year, on the first day of spring, someone leaves a white tulip on that bench. No name, no note, just the flower. Because in old age, and even after, love never leaves. It simply changes chairs. Some love stories never end. They simply fade into the corners of a quiet porch, rest inside an untouched teacup, or breathe gently in the space between two chairs. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you of someone, or made you hold your own silence just a little closer, then maybe you were meant to find it. And if your heart still believes in the kind of love that doesn't need noise to be real, then come sit with us again sometime. There's always a second teacup waiting here. And maybe, just maybe, the next story will be yours. To stay with us through more quiet evenings, tap gently on the bell, whisper a like, and share this silence with someone who still believes.